Well, hey, my name is Matt Steen. I'm one of the co-founders of Chemistry Staffing. And today I want to talk a little bit about something that we don't necessarily talk about in Bible college, in seminary, in pastor gatherings, and that's knowing when to leave. Knowing when to leave is one of the most difficult things that we can do as a pastor. Knowing when to leave is painful but is at the same time is beneficial for you, your family, and your church. And so, over the course of our time together, I want to talk about three general assumptions that I have going into these types of conversations. I want to talk about four good reasons to leave your church and three gauges that we need to be aware of as we're determining whether it's time to go or not. And so if we can, let's dive right in, okay? First assumption that I have going into these conversations is this. If ministry is hard, that means you're in ministry, okay? If ministry is hard, that means you're in ministry. What do I mean by that? I mean, leaving because it's hard is probably not a good reason. Ministry is one of the most difficult occupations that we can have. We're always on. There's always weight and burden. We never know when our job is done. And so, when things get tough, when there's drama with our board, all that kind of stuff, that's just part of of the role. That's part of the job. That's part of what we've been called to. And so if ministry is hard, that just means you're in ministry. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's time to leave. Second assumption. Second assumption is this. Leaving a ministry position should be hard. If it isn't, you're doing it wrong. Let that sink in. Leaving a ministry position should be hard. If it isn't, you're doing it wrong. One of the reasons why it's easy for us to stay far longer than we need to is because it is tough to leave our ministry role. It's tough to uproot our lives and our family. One of the things that I've become convinced of, and this is probably worth the price of admission here, this will be the most astounding point that we make in this entire conversation. One of the things I've become convinced of is this: the church is not Starbucks. Okay? I know you're just wowed. You're absolutely in awe of the fact that the church is not Starbucks. What do I mean by this, and why is this so important? Starbucks, if you're familiar with the organization, and I would imagine that you're in ministry, you've got to be. Starbucks monetize what they call the third space, okay? Starbucks would say that there's three spaces in life. The first is your home space, the second is your workspace, the third is your community space. And so what they decided is that they wanted to go and they wanted to monetize this third space and sell $17 cups of mediocre coffee to have people come and linger in their spaces and spend more and more money. And they wanted to be a place where the community would come together and all that kind of stuff. Now, whether they do that or not effectively, that's for you to decide. But that's what they've done, and they've kind of stolen the concept of the church and they've gone and monopolized it. Okay, so they've monetized the third space. Why is this important, and why am I talking about Starbucks? Here's the reason. It's this. Ministry people, we don't have three spaces in our lives. We have one. Okay? And when we leave our church, we disrupt all three of those spaces simultaneously. And not only do we do it for ourselves, we do it for our family, for our kids, our spouses. And that's pretty significant. That's a huge weight. That's a huge tension to feel as we're processing through whether it is time for us to go or not. And so many times we tend to stay way longer than we should because we don't want to uproot our workspace and our home life and our community space. And so we stay. That's the second assumption. Okay? Third assumption is this. I say that Goldilocks is dead. Other people say it's never just right. Okay? There's three times that we can leave. We can leave when we haven't been there long enough. We can leave when we've been there a little too long, or we can leave when we've been there way too long. Okay? Here's the deal. Leaving when we haven't been there long enough doesn't allow God to do what he needs to do in us and in the lives of our church. A lot of times when we leave because things have gotten hard, we're leaving, when we haven't been there long enough. We can stay way too long, and oftentimes we do because we don't want to give up. We don't want to go through the pain of uprooting all these relationships in this community that we've established. And so we stay way too long. What I tell people and what I encourage you to do is stay just a little too long. Because you're never going to be just right. You want to stay just a little too long. and then begin the process of moving on. Okay, so that's my 3 assumptions. Here's the 4 reasons that I think are good reasons to move on, okay? 4 reasons. The first, you have a change in your sense of call, okay? Second is, and I'll come back to these, the second is you become a lid for your ministry. The third is boredom. The fourth is toxicity. So let's dive into these a little bit more. You have a change in your sense of call. This can happen. Over the course of our time in ministry, we can start to sense that God is moving us into a different space. God is moving us into a different type of ministry. Just the other day, I was talking to a guy in the Northeast who had been a pastor at a church of about 150 for 8 years, and slowly began to sense that God was shifting what he was being called to. Ultimately, he ended up coming on to church staff as a creative arts director, basically overseeing what the weekend services would look like. And he wasn't a worship pastor himself, but he made sure that the worship service was created and crafted in a way that was honoring to God and honoring to people, and was able to communicate a point that made sense. His call had shifted, and he realized that he needed to move out of the church that he was at into the new place. And so for that reason, he moved on. So our call shifting can change in any which way. It can mean that, maybe God is telling us that our time in pastoral ministry is done. Maybe our time as a youth pastor or a children's pastor is over, and we need to look at a campus pastor or a senior pastor or executive pastor role. Maybe our time as a senior pastor is coming to a close, and God is calling us into maybe intentional interim work or coming alongside and coaching other pastors. Who knows what that looks like? The options here are infinite. But when we start to sense that God is changing our call, it's time for us to listen and move on. Okay? That's the first one. Second one, you become the lid for our ministry. We talked about Starbucks earlier and how they sell $17 cups of overpriced, mediocre coffee. On the top of each of those coffee cups is a lid. And the lid, its responsibility is to keep the coffee inside that cup, right? Now, there are times in our ministry where we become the lid on our ministry. And whereas it's a good thing to have a lid on a coffee cup, it's not necessarily good to have a lid on ministry, because we become the limiting factor, the thing that holds back what our church is able to do. Now, this can be a painful process to go through because it requires a whole awful lot of just awareness of ourselves and what we're good at, what we're strong, what we're best gifted for, and what God has called us to ministry-wise. And so there comes times where we are called to a church for a season, to take a church to a certain point and then step away. And for us to stay after that certain point, it forces us to become the lid on that ministry. So there's a lot of different ways that this looks. Some of us are gifted to lead churches of 200. And God bless you if you are. We need more good, solid pastors of churches of 200. That's the majority of churches in this nation. We need you to be serving in that type of a place. If the church grows because of the work that you've done, and it takes to a place where you're just out of your comfort zone or out of your depth or your skill set, please step aside. Move into the next church that you can serve with that. Sometimes we've been equipped to help a church through a sticky situation. Maybe it's an unhealthy elder board or something like that, where we've got the skill set to come in and help reset that board to health, and then allow it to move on. Come in, do what God has called you to do, and before you become the lid, please move on. One of the hardest pieces of this is having that self-awareness to know what our gifting is. And so I would encourage you to be having these conversations regularly with mentors, with people who know you, to be able to say, hey, this is why you're here for this time. Okay. Third good reason is boredom. Okay? You look in the Old Testament, in the springtime, when kings went off to war, David stayed home. And we know how that ended. Boredom. When we start to get bored as a pastor, when we start to get into a place where we're constantly just kind of doing the same thing, going through the motions, not necessarily, feeling passionate about what God has called us to, not feeling passionate about the work that we're doing, and we just kind of cruise through it, that's an indicator that it's time for us to move. It's an indicator that it's time for us to step out and let somebody come in with a fresh sense of passion, a fresh sense of calling, step into that ministry and lead and take it to the place that it needs to go. But it takes guts for us to admit that we're bored. It takes guts for us to say, you know what? I've done what I can do here. It's time for me to move on. The fourth good reason to move on is toxicity. Now, I'm going to have this conversation two different ways. If you are in a ministry staff role, and by that I mean a youth pastor, a children's pastor, potentially a worship pastor, whatever that type of role is, we have a tendency as pastors, as ministry people, to say, I can overcome this toxicity and I can bring health. More often than not, that's a nice thought, but it's not going to happen. If you're in a toxic situation, you need to go. If you're in a toxic situation, you need to care for your soul enough to get to a place of safety. If you're in a place where you're not able to speak honestly, if you're walking around on eggshells, if you're not able to speak truth, it's probably time to move on. And I would encourage you to do so as quickly as possible. Now, senior leaders, you have, in most cases, the ability to right the ship when it's a toxic environment. And I would encourage you to work towards that. But there are times when we have a board that is so toxic, or a congregational family or situation that is so toxic that it begins to take, to eat at our soul. It begins to become corrosive to the spiritual lives of our family and ourselves. In those situations, I would encourage you to perhaps move on. One of the questions that I ask as we interview people, when I ask people that are in a rough situation, I just say to them, hey, how long can you be there before it starts to negatively impact your spiritual life? And the answers are telling. People will typically say, oh, I can be here for 12 months, or I can be here for another 8 months or 3 months. And my rule of thumb is I take that number and I divide by 2 or 3, and you should do the same. We tend to be pretty positive and overly confident in how long we can stay in a situation. So I would encourage you, as you ask that question, divide by 2 or 3. So those are the 4 reasons. Those are the 4 good reasons that we see for moving on. Changing a sense of call, you become a lid for ministry, boredom, and toxicity in your church. Now, let's talk about three ways to discern when it's time to move on. Okay, the first one is what I call our internal gauges. We're designed by God in just incredible ways. And so what we need to be constantly keeping an eye on is how is our health? And when I say health, I'm talking about our physical health, because our situations impact our physical health, right? I talk about our mental health, our emotional health, and our spiritual health. We need to make sure that we are healthy, in a healthy place. And if the church is starting to impact for the negative, our emotional, physical, mental, or spiritual health, we need to start to ask some hard questions about whether it's time to stay or go. We need to ask some hard questions about how do we get this righted? How do we get back to a place of health so that we can continue to minister in the way that God has called us to, okay? That's the first piece. We check our internal gauges. Our second piece is our mentors. Now, this is typically the awkward part of the conversation here, because a lot of us in ministry, we like to advocate that everybody should have a mentor, but how many of us genuinely have mentors in our lives that can pull us aside and have hard conversations? That's a rhetorical question. If you are listening to this now and you do not have a mentor in your life that has the ability to pull you aside and say, hey, tell me about this, please, for the sake of your soul, for the sake of your family, for the sake of your congregation, find somebody. Be honest with them. Bring them in on your situation. Bring them into your world and allow them to speak. One of the cool things about having started a company like Chemistry is our entire team is made up of people that have been in ministry for years. And so I've been able to bring some of these mentors of mine onto our team. And just last January, we had our team together down in Orlando for a weekend of just kind of very important business meetings. We'll leave it at that. And one of these mentors in my life pulled me aside at one point and said, Matt, I know you. And you know where that conversation is going to go. And you always get a little nervous when somebody says that. I know you. I know how you're wired. How are you keeping yourself from getting bored in this season? Now, this was my friend Chet, and Chet worked with me together. We worked together at a church. He did my wedding, and we've kept in touch through the years and have had hard conversations with each other on and on. And it's just one of those garden friends, one of those people that can speak into my life. And he knows me. He knows that I'm an Enneagram 7. He knows that I'm an ENFP. He knows that I'm the type that I go chasing after squirrels and shiny objects all the time. He knows that if I'm in one place too long, I start to get bored. And when I get bored, I get destructive. And so Chad, knowing that I've been in this space, in this role for 5 years, pulled me aside and loved me enough to say, hey, how are you keeping from getting bored? And I gave him an answer. And then he said, okay, that's nice. How are you keeping from getting bored? Have those people in your lives. Have people in your lives that are going to press you on this, that are going to ask you the hard questions, that are going to challenge you when you say to them, hey, I think it's time for me to leave. Have those people in your life. Lean on them. The last way that I tell people to discern whether it's time to move on or not is through looking at our family. Now, I put our family intentionally last, because we don't want to have our family on this roller coaster of do we leave or do we stay, or do we leave or do we stay? We don't want to do that, right? One of the things that Teresa, my wife, had to learn early on in our marriage, and I had to learn this too, was that because of my wiring that I shared, we'll go on vacation and I'll want to go look at real estate listings and say, hey, we should move here. And each time we would do that, she would roll her eyes. She's an accountant. She likes stability. Say, oh, what are we in for now? And we had to realize that, this too will pass for the good of our family, for the sake of our family health. She had to realize that, this is a little shiny, it'll disappear. But in the same way, we want to be careful with our families, not to be dragging them on that emotional roller coaster. Oh, we're leaving. Oh, no, we're staying. Oh, we're leaving. So we don't necessarily go and ask them those questions. But what we will do is be observing. Is this a healthy place for my family still? Is my family becoming more and more godly because of our time here? Is this a safe and healthy place for our souls? Your first ministry is your family. And we need to live like that's the case. And we need to be keeping an eye on whether or not they are healthy because of where we are. And if it becomes an unhealthy place, if it becomes a toxic place for our family, we need to be willing to step back and say, okay, it's time to go. One of the things that we learned over the course of the pandemic is we had to change how we ask questions and how we interview people. Instead of saying, hey, so is your wife on board with this? Now the question became, is your wife going to church? Can your wife go to church and not hate everybody's guts because of the way that they're treating you? That's real. And we need to make sure that our family is able to genuinely worship and genuinely be part of the church community that we're serving in. So what we want to make sure is we want to check our internal gauges, our mental, physical, emotional, spiritual health. Be checking in with mentors and asking them the hard questions about whether it's time to stay or go, and letting them challenge us as well. And we want to be keeping an eye on our families, making sure that it's a healthy, safe place for them to be and grow spiritually. Now, as an organization, chemistry staffing, we have some resources for church leaders who are in this process of discernment. And so if you're asking these questions, we'd love to share a download with you. It's called Knowing When to Leave and How to Leave Well. It's a couple of books. The author has given us permission to share these with you. But this QR code, if you can scan it with your phone, will take you to a download page where you can get a copy of these. A couple things to remember. One, these books ask us a lot of questions that we don't necessarily want to answer. And so I'd encourage you to read them with a box of tissues nearby. The second thing is read this with your spouse. Read it with your spouse and answer the questions and compare notes and see how each of you are doing. And the third thing that I would encourage you to do is just remember that this is an ebook, because there's times when you're going to want to throw this across the room. And that can get pretty expensive if you're reading it on an iPad or an e-reader. Know this, we at Chemistry, we are grateful for the work that you do. We're grateful for the sacrifice that you put out on a daily basis for your church. We are grateful for your love of the Lord and your desire to pursue the calling that He's got on your life. And because of that, we are championing you, we are cheering for you, and we want nothing more than to see you succeed. If there's a way that we can serve you, if there's a way that we can come alongside of you, even if we can just be a friend to talk through as you're wrestling through whether it's time to move on or not, please track us down. Chemistrystaffing.com is where to find us. Thank you.